In the last half-hour, world prepares for U.S. sanctions on Iran. In the last 2 hours, Iranian oil exports set to continue under U.S. sanctions. In the last 4 hours, strange bedfellows, Iran sanctions, EU posturing in volatile oil markets. France urges Europe to act on unacceptable U.S.-Iran sanctions. U.S. sanctions against Iran to affect oil supply balance. May, Trump plan talks over Iran sanctions. Britain, U.S. discuss sanctions impact on firms in Iran. UK's May, Trump agree talks needed over Iranian sanctions. UK's May and Trump agree talks needed over Iranian sanctions. PM and Donald Trump discuss impact of U.S. sanctions on Iran. May and Trump agree talks needed over Iranian sanctions. Crude oil rally may not last, despite outlook for Iran sanctions. Trump condemned for slapping sanctions on Iran. In the last 6 hours, Europe is threatening to fight Trump on Iran sanctions. In the last 8 hours, Europe won't rally around sanctions on Iran. Russia Sukhoi plans to supply SSJ-100R planes to Iran despite U.S. sanctions. Europe faces tough battle against new Iran sanctions. How will Iran's economy hold up if sanctions return? Yesterday, Iran aims to buy Airbus jets before sanctions window closes. Official Europe still buying Iranian oil amid sanctions threat. Europe prepares countermeasures against U.S.-Iran sanctions. Minister, Iran's oil industry can thwart sanctions. Rouhani, new U.S. sanctions on Iran violating UNSC's Resolution 2231. Morning brief. U.S. imposes sanctions on Iran-linked currency exchange. U.S. announces sanctions on Iran-linked currency exchange network. Iran aims to buy Airbus jets before sanctions window closes. Official unacceptable. France calls on EU to fight U.S. sanctions on Iran. France urges pushback against unacceptable U.S.-Iran sanctions. Which European firms stand to lose from U.S.-Iran sanctions? France vows pushback on U.S.-Iran sanctions. Turkey to be hard hit by U.S. sanctions against Iran. Oil steady at multi-year highs as Iran sanctions tighten supply outlook. France, Germany urge Europe to act on U.S.-Iran sanctions. France vows pushback against U.S. sanctions on Iran. Oil near multi-year highs as Iran sanctions tighten supply outlook. China's petro yuan to gain leverage over Iran sanctions. New U.S. sanctions on Iranian citizens and businesses. U.S. imposes fresh sanctions on Iranian entities. Iran sanctions may trigger currency shift. Day chief. France condemns U.S. over Iran sanctions. Fitch, sanctions on Iran to affect oil supply balance. Oil prices remain near multi-year highs on looming sanctions against Iran. U.S. expands sanctions on Iran. U.S. turns the sanctions screw on Iran. U.S. sanctions 9 Iranian individuals, entities over currency exchange network. France slams unacceptable new U.S. sanctions on Iran. French FM slams unacceptable U.S. sanctions on Iran. U.S. faces tougher task imposing Iran sanctions this time around. Who are winners and losers from U.S. oil sanctions on Iran? The U.S. increases sanctions pressure on Iran. Iran turns to Bitcoin in preparation for renewed U.S. sanctions. U.S. sanctions on Iran. India may revive rupee real trade. Who are the winners and losers from U.S. oil sanctions on Iran? U.S. issues sanctions on Iran-linked currency exchange network. In the last 7 days, U.S. sanctions Iranian individuals and companies playing U.S. sanctions. China walks a fine line in Iran. Iran oil sanctions could advance China's petro yuan. Will renewed sanctions against Iran backfire on the U.S.? European powers could clash over re-imposition of Iran sanctions. America imposes sanctions against Iranian entities. Rupee slide likely to continue as U.S. sanctions threat looms over Iran. Any U.S. sanctions on Iran violate Resolution 2231. U.S. sanctions Iran currency network used to fund military. U.S. Treasury issues new sanctions on Iran. U.S. sanctions on Iran to hurt Kenya tea sales. Any new U.S. sanctions on Iran violates Resolution 2231. U.S. imposes sanctions on Iran. Revolutionary Guards financial networks. U.S. slaps sanctions on Revolutionary Guards after Iran nuke deal pullout. Ankara vows to help resist U.S. sanctions on Iran. U.S. sanctions hit Iran Revolutionary Guard currency network.